This session is brought to you with the help of Sundial Cannabis, the natural alternative for modern wellness. Hello and welcome to Sessions by the Herb Life. As you probably know, Sessions is a podcast that aims to bring forth the conversations happening on the ground of this exciting industry. Now, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the final episode of Season 2, and I'm very excited today because I am, for this one episode only, no longer the facilitator. I am indeed the most gracious host. So I'd like to thank the Herb Life for giving me the opportunity to talk about what I am doing in the cannabis industry. Today I'm joined by my husband and business partner, Surjeet Shetty, and we have recently moved back to Australia. We spent the last 3 years working in the cannabis industry. Well, rather, I spent the last 3 years working in the cannabis industry. I'll let him talk about his own personal experience with the plant. Essentially, we wanted to take you all on a tour down under and kind of talk about the experience that we had, living and working in Canada, where the cannabis landscape is quite evolved, and then talk about how that experience has now, informed the way that we live in Australia, where cannabis is still very heavily stigmatized. So we're going to run this session as a bit of a Q&A. So I'm going to ask Surjeet the very first question. And what I'd like to know, Surj, is how has Vancouver or living in Vancouver shaped your cannabis experience?
Hi, everyone. This is Surj. First of all, thank you, Tiyana, for having me on, and the Herb Life, of course. Just to give a bit of a background, I was born and raised in South India. Although India's, at least in recent times, is seen as this culture that is all accepting of cannabis, it is a bit more complicated than what it initially seems. At least in South India, cannabis is heavily stigmatized, where it is seen just as a drug and that nothing good is seen of it. But in my travels recently, I've seen that in northern India, it is more relaxed and it is seen as part of Hindu culture in some parts. So it is a bit of a dichotomy when it comes to India and cannabis. About 10 years ago, I moved to Australia to do my master's, and I would describe the Australian cannabis culture as something confusing, where on the one hand, it is heavily stigmatized, and on the other hand, the people that consume it do it more from hedonistic viewpoint. But going to Vancouver, I personally think my view of cannabis changed in terms of being exposed to a culture that was seeing the plant for deeper meanings or deeper reasons than what I had seen before. I found Vancouver to be quite a cannabis-friendly culture, where if you walk out of your apartment and it's 7 a.m. and someone's smoking a joint, you don't really think twice about it. And it made you feel in place if you did like cannabis.
How have your cannabis consumption patterns changed? What's different to when you were in Australia versus when you were in Vancouver?
The big difference is, I think, before cannabis meant a joint or just grass, and if you...
Spun with tobacco, of course.
Yeah, spliff, as the English call it. But even going to, say, Nepal or India, where you see hash and you see the most basic ingredients when it comes to thinking of cannabis. But then going to, the West Coast, you're exposed to all these, the topicals and the edibles and tinctures. And I think that's what I got most out of it. Even simple things like terpenes and how indica and sativa is a thing of a bygone era. Like, things like that don't really stick elsewhere, whereas North America are the pioneers of cannabis culture. So that's what I feel like, and, I can explore that more. But yeah, I think when a culture progresses with any substance or equipment or ingredient or a tool, whatever you want to call it, when a culture runs with it, it opens up new doors, and that's what I essentially got to see in these grey markets or legal markets or decriminalised markets all across the northwest coast, from Vancouver to LA. So I think what it has done is given people the opportunity to explore and create products that cater to people like us. There is no drama. There is no questions to be asked. We're law-abiding citizens, and we have the right to enjoy ourselves. and explore our own consciousness. So having lived in Vancouver for the past few years, I would say both our perspective on cannabis has changed. So what is your take on that?
Well, I suppose... Okay, so there's a few things. So one, sorry, I've got notes and I'll try not to read off of those because it sounds very disingenuous. And I'll just quickly let you guys know it is 43 degrees today here in Melbourne, and Serge and I are in a room where we've had to turn off all the fans and no air conditioner, so we are literally sitting in a sauna. So, I do apologize if you guys hear us slurping on water or moving around very uncomfortably from all the sweatiness that's happening. Anyway, so back to your question. What do I think, or my perspective, how has it changed? So I started consuming cannabis, as you know, around 13 or 14. It was very recreational with friends, just as a bit of fun. A lot of kids around that age were consuming in Australia anyway. But I never really thought of cannabis as a tool for health and well-being. That's just something that never even crossed my mind. I always viewed it as something you do when you're having fun with friends, something that was perhaps a little bit taboo, which didn't bother me, but it was always an equivalent to alcohol rather than, something that was healthy. I guess the first and biggest thing that cannabis did for me, that Vancouver did for me, was as soon as I started working in the cannabis industry, I started meeting people who had these radically different views on cannabis. And the way that they talked about it really made sense, that this is something that you could use as a tool for your health and wellness or your health and well-being, that this is something that you could use to alleviate stress and it has less side effects than, say, alcohol, that this is something that can be used as medicine and it helps a lot of people with a range of different issues. Obviously, the medical cannabis conversation is, a whole nother kettle of fish, but it's something that I hadn't really considered. So that's the first thing, was that, moving to Vancouver made me realize that cannabis can actually be used as a really great tool to enhance someone's healthy lifestyle. The second thing was that, and I have this, I believe, on my Herb Life writer bio, is that cannabis was indeed a gateway for me, and it was a gateway to understanding my body better. It was a gateway to learning about other plant medicines. It was a gateway to learning about how I can implement different approaches to managing my stress or to managing things like depression and anxiety that I had around work or life in general. And so being part of that community in Vancouver has changed my life for real, to the point where I don't think I would have had access to that level of information or that level of insight had I just lived in Australia. I had to move to Vancouver to get that. I had to live there for 3 years. I had to be surrounded by all of those people to be able to learn about this plant in such an in-depth way. And even then, I'm miles behind. I've only been working in the industry for 2.5, 3 years, and there are people that have been working in it for 20 years advocating for the plant. So in terms of, what Vancouver has done, I think I've gone off on a tangent a little bit, but it's radically changed my perspective on cannabis. To me, it's no longer a plant that you just use to get high. It is a plant that you can use to really change your life for the better.
Has it changed the way you consume the plant? There are so many different ways to, and that you may be classified as a casual consumer.
Yeah, so, the way I consume cannabis changes from, month to month, year to year. Sometimes I consume regularly, a couple times a week, at night, maybe an edible, maybe a vape. Sometimes I consume once a month. I think I consume a cannabis topical daily. I have this amazing oil that I put on after I shower and, keeps me nice and moisturized. So really I'm a daily consumer of cannabis. I just am not a typical daily consumer of cannabis. Now that's something that you and I were going to talk about Anyway, so we both consume cannabis very differently. I am what you would call, I think you just said, a casual consumer. You are a pretty regular consumer. So we personally haven't talked much about this, and I want to know, considering the difference in accessibility here, now that we've moved back to Melbourne, how are you coping with that? And like, what is the level of accessibility, if you want to tell everyone?
I am what you would consider a regular consumer, but it's not like I smoke all day, every day. I smoke maybe twice or 3 times a week, or I used to, Vancouver, but it was, my preferred methods were either joints or edibles, and I used to take tincture for, say, the MMA training that I used to do.
Right. So you only started really consuming cannabis for fitness in Vancouver. So I would say that that's something that really changed, and you really got into it using cannabis for, and actually other things as well. But
yeah, I was going to say I did spend a few months writing fiction, like short stories, and cannabis has in a lot of ways a muse in terms of it helping with the creative side of things. Cannabis can be consumed in different ways, but for me, the accessibility was what made it such a sweeter experience, because I could tailor it based on what my requirements were. If I was training, I could just take, say, a 10 milligrams so I wasn't too high. But after training, I could take 30 milligrams and really feel the effects and help me nurse my, pain from the hard work I'd put in. So cannabis is, in a lot of ways, I mean, as complex as it is, it's also open to being tailored to each one of our needs. It's not like, the way I see cannabis is it's almost like MMA in certain ways, where you go in to train with the intent of doing your best. You may win most times, but some days you're going to lose, and it's a learning, it's a day to learn. And similarly, cannabis does tell on you sometimes, where it becomes sort of a paranoid experience. But if we take it as a learning experience, and that we hide emotions and thoughts that we don't want to ever see, and sometimes cannabis just puts it in front of you and you have to deal with it. So it's not for everyone, and I see why some people are so against it. It makes them feel uncomfortable. I get uncomfortable in dark places or in the high places. So, we all have our own fears, but it does have a way of putting it in front of you where you have to come to terms with it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I really like that you said that, that cannabis, the way that we consume cannabis is all very individualized. It's not the same for any two people, and you and I are great examples of that. Although our experience with cannabis is different, we're quite similar people. We circulate, and we have the same circle of friends. We do the same things. We have this, very similar interests, yet our consumption is entirely different. I'm a huge fan of cannabis for when I need it in the way that I need it, but I don't need it every day. And but the discomfort aspect that you mentioned, it's also really interesting because it's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't return to cannabis. And part of what I loved about Vancouver, or, Canada in general, or wherever the cannabis conversation is happening, was that people who work in the industry really start to recognize how significant that one bad experience can be. And we really start to talk to people about not focusing on that, one bad experience, and to give people good experiences. If you're providing cannabis as food, or if you're, encouraging someone to consume, make sure that we, do things like start low and go slow, or that you're aware of the possible side effects around cannabis, that the safety procedures if you are to get too high, or what to say to someone that's too high. So again, I've gone off on a tangent. I seem to be doing it quite a lot, so sorry. But it is one thing that I really liked about Vancouver. The types of conversations that we have about cannabis extend farther than, just say no. And that's something that can only happen in an evolved market.
Okay, so considering we obviously consume very differently, why do you think it's so... Or why do you feel so strongly about advocating for a plant that you, say, rarely consume?
I think Partly because while my consumption can be described as like irregular, I suppose, I thoroughly enjoy it and I would like to access the product